It's February 13th, 2017, a Monday, and for the students of Delphi Community Middle School in Delphi, Indiana, it is an unexpected gift, a snow day that had been held back from winter and used on this particular February afternoon, which means no school, which means freedom, which means two 8th grade best friends named Abigail Williams and Liberty German are spending the afternoon the way 13 and 14-year-olds in a small Midwestern town spend a free afternoon, which is outside on a trail together, taking pictures and just being kids in the kind of town, population around 3,000, 60 miles northwest of Indianapolis, where parents generally don't worry too much about their kids going for a walk in the woods, because this is Delphi, Indiana, where everyone knows everyone, where the meatpacking plant is the biggest employer, and the kids go to the same schools their parents went to, and the community center has a sign out front, and people wave to each other from their driveways. And this is the kind of place, and this is the kind of afternoon where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Except that on this particular Monday, February 13th, 2017, something so terrible happens on the Monon High Bridge trail just outside of town that it will shatter that community and grip the entire country for the next 8 years. And the reason it grips the country is not just the horror of what happens to these two girls, but the fact that one of them, 14-year-old Liberty German, known to everyone who loved her as Libby, has the presence of mind, the courage, and the sheer instinct in the final moments of her life to pull out her phone and record the man who was about to kill her and her best friend Abby. And that recording, grainy and terrifying and barely 30 seconds long, becomes one of the most important and haunting pieces of digital evidence in the history of American true crime, a piece of evidence that would keep investigators chasing a ghost for 5.5 years before the answer turned out to be hiding in plain sight the whole time, working at the CVS pharmacy right there in Delphi, a man named Richard Allen, who had lived in that same town for over a decade, who had processed and printed photos of Abby and Libby for free at his job after they were killed, who had gone to the police himself just 3 days after the murders to volunteer that he had been on that trail that afternoon, whose tip then sat in a box with thousands of others for 5 years until a volunteer receptionist named Kathy Schenk happened to be digitizing old tips in September 2022 and noticed that the time Richard Allen said he was on the trail matched exactly the window during which investigators believed the girls had been killed. And when she submitted that tip to the lead detective, something clicked, something that should have clicked years earlier, and within weeks, Richard Allen was arrested, and within 2 years he was on trial, and in November 2024, a jury of 7 women and 5 men convicted him on all 4 counts of murder after 19 hours of deliberation, and on December 20th, 2024, almost 8 years to the month after Abby Williams and Libby German never came home from that trail, Richard Matthew Allen was sentenced to 130 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Indiana law, and that is where this story ends. But it is not where this story begins. So let's go back to the beginning, because these girls deserve to be known. And Libby German was born on December 27, 2002, which made her 14 years old at the time of her murder, and she lived with her grandparents, Mike and Becky Patty, who raised her and loved her, and who would become the face of a family's grief and advocacy for the next 8 years as they fought for answers. And Libby was the kind of kid who was curious and funny and sharp, the kind of teenager who posted photos on Snapchat and walked trails in the winter cold and thought nothing of pulling her phone out to document a beautiful afternoon on a bridge above Deer Creek. And Abigail Williams was born on June 23, 2003, which made her 13 years old, and she was Libby's best friend, the two of them inseparable in the way that middle school best friends can be. And on February 13, 2017, it was Libby's older sister, Kelsey German, who dropped the two girls off at approximately 1:49 in the afternoon near the entrance of the Delphi Historic Trails by the Mears Farm on the north side of County Road 300 North. And before Kelsey drove away, she and Libby told each other they loved each other, and that was the last time Kelsey saw her sister alive.
and the girls set off down the trail toward the Monon High Bridge, which was at that time an abandoned railroad trestle crossing high above Deer Creek, a wooden bridge with no guardrails, no handrails, open to the cold February air 60 feet above the water below. And it was the kind of structure that teenagers are drawn to, because what teenagers don't like a thrill. And at around 2:07 in the afternoon, Libby posted a photo to Snapchat of Abby walking across the Monon High Bridge, and that was the last social media post from either of them. And what happened in the minutes that followed is something Libby documented without anyone in the world knowing she had done it until after the girls were already gone. Because at some point on that bridge, Libby noticed a man walking towards them that set off something in her gut, some alarm that a 14-year-old girl should never have to feel on a sunny Monday afternoon in her hometown. And she did something remarkable. She pulled out her phone and she started recording, and the video she captured, later enhanced by investigators, is 43 seconds long, shows the trail, shows Abby, and then shows a man in dark jeans and a blue jacket and a hat walking towards the girls across the bridge with his hands in his pockets. And near the end of the video, a man's low, muffled voice can be heard saying the words that would haunt the country for years, "Guys, down the hill." And then the video ends. And Libby's father was supposed to pick the girls up that afternoon, but when he arrived at the trailhead, he couldn't reach his daughter by phone, and he couldn't find them when he searched. And the girls were reported missing that evening, and a massive
Community-wide search began in Delphi and the surrounding area with Indiana State Police, the FBI, local law enforcement, and volunteers all pouring into Carroll County to find them. And on February 14th, Valentine's Day, the bodies of Abigail Williams and Liberty German were found in the woods near Deer Creek, approximately 2/10 of a mile northeast of the Monon High Bridge. And they had been there since the previous afternoon, and their throats had been cut, and their bodies had been partially covered with sticks in what investigators would later describe as an attempt at concealment. And Libby was found without clothing, while Abby was found wearing Libby's sweatshirt and jeans. And a single unspent .4 caliber round was found near the bodies, one bullet that had been cycled through a gun but never fired, one bullet that would eventually become one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire case. And the pathologist who examined the bodies testified at trial that Abby had one 7-inch long wound on the side of her neck, and that Libby had 4 or 5 wounds on her neck with the 3 main blood vessels severed. And these were 8th grade girls, and the whole town of Delphi was devastated. And Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, later described learning how Libby died because the funeral director had told the family they needed to bring in clothes and had told them to make sure they had a scarf. And within 48 hours of the bodies being found, Indiana State Police released the grainy still image from Libby's phone of the man on the bridge and asked the public for help identifying him. And on February 22nd, they released the audio, that muffled voice saying, "Guys, down the hill." And in the days and weeks that followed, the case exploded nationally, with tips pouring in at such a rate that the Delphi murder tip line had to be routed to the FBI's Major Case Contract Center in Washington, D.C., because of the sheer volume. And the FBI put the case on electronic billboards in 46 states, and former Indianapolis Colts punter Pat McAfee and team owner Jim Irsay donated nearly $100,000 to push the reward fund to $200,000. And the whole country was looking, and yet nobody could find the man on the bridge. And the investigation dragged on. And in July 2017, investigators released a composite sketch of the suspect based on eyewitness accounts from other hikers on the trail that day. And in April 2019, they released a second revised sketch and a plea to the public, noting that investigators had reason to believe the suspect was hiding in plain sight and was almost certainly familiar with the Delphi area from living or working there.
And that plea was more accurate than anyone knew at the time, because Richard Allen had in fact already walked into a police station just 3 days after the murders on February 16, 2017, and had spoken with a conservation officer assisting with the investigation in a grocery store parking lot, and told the officer that he had been walking on the Monon High Bridge trail between 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon on February 13th and had seen 3 females near the bridge. And the officer typed up his notes and submitted the paperwork for the investigative file. And then that piece of paper sat in a box with tens of thousands of other tips for 5 full years without anyone flagging it. And the Carroll County Sheriff, Tony Liggett, testified at trial that the Allen tip fell through the cracks and that Allen had been hiding in plain sight. And Allen went right back to his life in Delphi after that, and he worked at the CVS pharmacy in town, the same CVS where Libby's grandparents, Mike and Becky Patty, went. And Becky Patty would later confirm that after the girls were killed, Allen had actually printed photos of Abby and Libby at no charge at his job, photos that were then displayed at the girls' funerals. And he attended community gatherings, and he lived in a house 2.5 miles from the trail. And years went by, and Abby and Libby's families held vigils and gave interviews and begged for answers, and watched 2 composite sketches circulate across the internet and disagreed with each other on social media about which sketch was more accurate. And true crime podcasters and YouTubers and amateur sleuths built entire online communities around the case. And investigators followed thousands of leads, including at one point looking at a man named Daniel Nations in Colorado and separately looking at a man named Klein, who was eventually convicted of child exploitation charges but was never charged in the Delphi murders. And none of it broke the case open. And then, in September 2022, a volunteer receptionist named Kathy Schenk was sitting at the Carroll County Sheriff's Office helping investigators digitize and organize old tips into an online database when she pulled up a tip that had been called in 5 years earlier, a tip from a man named Richard Allen, who said he had been on the trail the afternoon the girls disappeared and had seen 3 females near the bridge. And Kathy Schenk looked at the time Allen said he was there, and she looked at the window during which investigators believed the girls had been on that bridge, and she realized the timing matched. And she submitted the tip to the detective in charge of the investigation because she thought it was worth looking into. And when investigators took a second look at Richard Allen, everything started to fall into place, because Allen had in a subsequent interview in October 2022 told authorities he had worn jeans and a black or blue jacket that day and had gone to the bridge to watch fish. And investigators looked at the footage from Libby's phone, and they looked at the man in the dark jeans and the blue jacket walking across the bridge. And they looked at ballistics evidence from the unspent .4 caliber round that had been found between the girls' bodies at the crime scene. And a prosecution firearms expert would later testify at trial that that cartridge had been cycled through Richard Allen's .4 caliber Sig Sauer handgun. And investigators also noted that a black 2016 Ford Focus had been seen on security video
near the area that afternoon, and that Allen owned the only such car registered in Carroll County when the murders took place. And on October 26, 2022, Richard Matthew Allen was taken into custody at the Indiana State Police Lafayette Post, and on October 28, he was formally charged with 2 counts of murder. And Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter stood at a press conference and told the gathered media and the families of Abby and Libby that today was not a day to celebrate, but that the arrest of Richard Allen was a major step toward the conclusion of a long, complex investigation. And Allen was moved to a state facility for his safety and held in solitary confinement while awaiting trial. And what happened next was one of the most legally turbulent pre-trial periods in Indiana criminal justice history, with repeated delays, the leak of crime scene photographs that caused Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter to publicly beg people to delete the images and stop re-victimizing the families,
The withdrawal of Allen's original court-appointed public defenders and their subsequent reinstatement by the Indiana Supreme Court, gag orders, appeals, defense motions to throw out the bullet evidence, which the defense characterized as flimsy, and a bizarre and sensational defense theory that the girls had been killed as part of a ritual sacrifice by a group of Odinists, a theory that Carroll County prosecutor Nick McLeland dismissed as a fanciful defense for social media to devour, and that Special Judge Francis Gull, who had been brought in from Allen County in northeastern Indiana to oversee the trial, along with a sequestered jury from the same county, rejected, ruling that the probative value of such evidence was greatly outweighed by its potential to mislead the jury. And the trial finally began on October 18, 2024, 7 years and 8 months after Abby and Libby were killed, in the Carroll County seat of Delphi, their hometown, the same small town where Richard Allen had lived and worked and hidden for all those years. And the courthouse was packed every day of the 4-week trial with family members and locals and reporters and true crime podcasters and YouTubers who had been following the case for years, with people reportedly paying others to hold their spots in line the night before the trial started. And in his opening statement, Prosecutor McLeland told the jury that Richard Allen, armed with a gun, had forced the 2 girls off the hiking trail and had planned to rape them before a passing van made him change his plans and he cut their throats. And over the course of the trial, the prosecution presented the cell phone video, the ballistic evidence linking the unspent round to Allen's weapon, security footage of the black Ford Focus, and the testimony of multiple witnesses, including one woman named Sarah Carbaugh, who testified that as she was driving back from the trail on February 13th, she saw a man who she described as looking muddy, bloody, and unfriendly, and whom she identified as the man from the bridge video. And the prosecution also presented something that was arguably the most damning evidence of all, the fact that Richard Allen had confessed to the murders more than 60 times while in pre-trial detention, 61 confessions by the prosecution's count, confessions made to his wife Kathy Allen on recorded phone calls, confessions made to his mother, confessions made to prison employees and fellow inmates and to the warden, and most powerfully, confessions made to Monica Walla, the former lead psychologist at Westville Correctional Facility where Allen was housed, who testified that Allen initially told her he was innocent, but began confessing to the crimes in April 2023, around the time he was placed back on suicide watch, and who testified that Allen told her, "I killed Abby and Libby, I'm sorry," and that he had originally planned to sexually assault the victims but had run away when he saw a van nearby, and that he had cut the girls' throats and covered their bodies with sticks. And in one phone call to his wife that was played for the jury, Allen could be heard telling Kathy Allen, "I did it, I killed Abby and Libby," to which Kathy responded, "No, you didn't," and Allen replied, "Yes, I did." And the defense, led by attorneys Brad Rossi and Andrew Baldwin, argued that all of these confessions were false, that Allen's mental health had deteriorated rapidly during the 13 months he spent in solitary confinement before being moved to a different facility, and that he had been in a psychotic and delusional state during the confessions. And defense witnesses, including psychologists, testified that Allen had been delirious and that false confessions from individuals in states of mental duress are a documented and researched phenomenon in criminal psychology. And the defense also hammered the point that no DNA evidence linked Allen to the crime scene. A DNA expert for the state confirmed that none of Allen's DNA was found at the scene, and none of Abby or Libby's DNA was found on items recovered from his home, and the defense
questioned why more images had not been taken of the cartridge found near the bodies, and suggested the bullet could have come from law enforcement. And defense attorney Rossi argued that witnesses who said they saw the bridge guy gave physical descriptions that did not match Allen, and Allen himself had pleaded not guilty and sat through 4 weeks of trial, appearing, according to reporters in the courtroom, pale and wide-eyed and emotionless, holding his Bible as the verdict was read.
And after 19 hours of deliberation spread over 3 days, the jury of 7 women and 5 men came back on November 11, 2024, and Richard Allen was found guilty on all 4 counts: felony murder for the killing of Abigail Williams while attempting to commit kidnapping, felony murder for the killing of Liberty German while attempting to commit kidnapping, murder for knowingly killing Abby, and murder for knowingly killing Libby. And Allen's wife, Kathy, who had maintained her belief in his innocence throughout, tearfully told reporters outside the courthouse that this was not over, while Allen himself sat emotionless as the verdict was read and was then handcuffed and led away. And on December 20th, 2024, the families of Abby Williams and Libby German finally got to stand in a courtroom and speak. And Libby's mother, Carrie Timmons, who had attended every single day of the trial, spoke about the PTSD and depression and guilt and anxiety she has lived with, and said that Libby would be 22 years old now, but that the family has stopped celebrating her birthday because it is too difficult. And Mike Patty, Libby's grandfather, who had been the public face of the family's grief and advocacy for 8 long years, looked at Richard Allen and told him he should have taken accountability. And Diane Erskine, Abby's grandmother, spoke of the great sadness of the day. And Indiana State Police Lieutenant Jerry Holman called the crime brutal and told the judge that Abby and Libby had been stalked, kidnapped, humiliated, and treated like animals. And Special Judge Francis Gull, who had spent 27 years on the bench and said Allen ranked right up there with the most heinous crimes in the state of Indiana, looked at Allen and said, "These families will deal with your carnage forever," and then sentenced him to 65 years for each murder, to run consecutively for a total of 130 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed. And Allen sat with his prison uniform and ankle chains and looked over at the seats reserved for his family, which were empty. None of his relatives attended the sentencing and showed no reaction to his sentence. And after the sentencing, Carroll County Prosecutor Nicholas McClelland stood at the podium and thanked the investigators and the jury and the families. And then he said something that felt like the only right thing to say, which was that he would be remiss if he did not thank Abby and Libby themselves, and specifically Libby, for recording the defendant as he walked across the bridge, for having the wherewithal to pull out her phone and record that individual, for having the wherewithal to know that something wasn't right. Because that is the truth of this case, that a 14-year-old girl named Liberty German, in the final terrifying moments of her life on an abandoned railroad bridge in a small Indiana town on a February afternoon, did something that most adults would not think to do. She documented, she recorded, she left behind a record. And that record, that grainy 43-second video, that muffled voice saying, "Guys, down the hill," is what ultimately helped catch the man who killed her. And Abby and Libby are why the Delphi Community Middle School renamed its library the Abby and Libby Memorial Library. And they are why a sports complex was built in their memory. And they are why candles still get lit every February 13th in the town of Delphi. And they are why this case matters. And Richard Allen is currently appealing his conviction, his attorneys maintaining his innocence. But a jury of 12 people heard 4 weeks of evidence and deliberated for 19 hours and came back unanimous on all 4 counts. And a judge who has seen the worst of humanity in 27 years on the bench looked him in the eye and said he ranked among the most heinous. And the families of Abby and Libby, who waited 8 years for this verdict, who drove past that bridge in those woods and lived in the same small town as the man who killed their girls without knowing it, have said that the verdict does not bring the girls back and does not give them closure, but it gives them a little bit of peace to know that he can never hurt another person again. And Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, put it the most honestly when a reporter asked her if this felt like winning, and she said, "You could say we got our verdict, but that didn't bring the girls back, and it doesn't give us closure, it gives us a little bit of peace." And then she paused, and she said, "But is it happy? Not really. And no, it is not happy. It is the kind of justice that comes too late and costs too much and leaves a hole in a community that will never fully close. But it is justice. It is Richard Allen in prison for 130 years while Abby and Libby's families rebuild, while Delphi rebuilds, while the country that watched this case for 8 years finally has an answer. And the answer was hiding in plain sight the whole time, right there in that small Indiana town, behind a pharmacy counter. And if this story reached you today, share it, not for the drama of it, but for Abby and Libby, so their names keep being said, so their story keeps being told, because Libby German recorded the truth so we would know it, and the least we can do is keep listening.